Can't believe it's been over 2 years now since the release of Hedon's first episode. It's a retro-style first-person shooter running on the GZ Doom engine that feels like a bit of a mix between Arx Fatalis, Thief the Dark Project, with the crushing combat and puzzles of Hexen. Playing as a half-demon orc named Zan who wakes up with amnesia and then has to figure out what's going on. Getting embroiled in a plot involving a cult that's trying to steal this ancient technology from this faction of busty orcs and goblins called the Iron Division. Every weapon and enemy sprite, texture and effect was created from scratch, and it was a pretty tough game too, requiring a lot of exploration combined with some challenging shooting, lasting roughly 5 to 6 hours. Yeah, not bad value for something supposedly low budget.
What the hell am I doing in Hedon? This is a low budget game.
Well, the second episode, Bloodrite, is finally out, and the developer, also named Zan, has managed to dial things up even more, to the point that it really could have served as an entirely new game, but instead it's being released as a free update for people who already own it. Yeah, that's right, you're getting a 10 to 12 hour experience here for bugger all. And look, if you like what happened in the first episode, well, you're probably going to like what's going on here. If you've played anything made in the GZ Doom engine in recent years, well, you're going to know these games are very easy to pick up and play. And a big part of what I think shined through with Hedon was its weapons, which still managed to seem unique despite sticking to a tried and tested formula. Thankfully in Bloodrite, most of these weapons make a return, just with a few exceptions. For starters, you've got Zan's axe, which, unlike a lot of other FPS melee weapons, is actually pretty damn good, doing considerable damage and cutting through the basic enemies pretty easily. It's a high risk to high reward weapon though, but it is useful if you're running low on ammo and don't want to waste it on the weaker enemies. After that, you've got the spike gun and the frag fire. Now, the spike gun's like an automatic weapon, kind of like an assault rifle that fires, well, spikes. And the frag fire is basically your shotgun with a flamethrower alternate fire mode. Hellclaw is like Hedon's version of Doom's plasma rifle, firing slower moving projectiles that do heavy damage with an alternate fire mode that shoots out a little proximity mine and a reload mode where you can siphon ammo off enemies. Crushbow is your rocket launcher. It's kind of like a better version of the dynamite crossbow from Redneck Rampage. Did I already make that reference in my first video? And I'm sure Bubba and Leonard from Redneck Rampage would be proud.
Yes, you did! Yes, you did!
And I think this thing has some of the most satisfying sounding explosions in the entire game. And the alternate fire mode for this thing may as well be a goddamn railgun. The final couple of weapons I think are definitely my favorites. Now, the first one is the potion launcher, which does what it sounds like, shooting out either gas or acid potions, and the sound this thing makes when one of those potions goes off is just pure ASMR. The Cry Lance is like a more powerful version of the spike gun. It's a lance powered by crystals that fires an energy beam that shreds through enemies, with an alternate fire mode that's kind of like a weaker BFG. Now, Bloodrite doesn't add a whole heap to this roster, mostly because it doesn't need to all that much. In fact, the only thing that it adds is the pain gun, and no points for guessing what that thing's based off. There's even a new enemy type that carries this thing around too, which is very reminiscent of the chain gunners being added into Doom 2. And just like in Doom 2, you can expect these enemies to be put on ledges on the other side of the map to peck away at your health points. Shortly after Hedon originally got released, there was an update that also added in a new kick move. You could combine this with crouching or jumping for a slide or a jump kick. And it was one of the things that I missed out on when I first did a video on this thing, simply because it wasn't in the game at that stage. Playing around with it now in this second episode, I think it's a cool addition, but in a game where enemies tear you in your asshole so quickly, I just can't really justify using it all that much. And kind of like a fart in a phone booth, I think keeping your distance from enemies is just a much safer idea here. It's also, I think that Berserker difficulty is just kind of completely pointless. Now, this is a difficulty mode that removes all of the ranged weapons and forces you to use melee, but then on the flip side, it also increases the enemy spawn, so okay. And I just can't see the point of this outside of maybe finishing it for bragging rights or something. It's definitely not fun to play through. I think you'd have more fun teabagging a cactus plant. Nothing else though, it is animated pretty well, and getting a glimpse at some thick orcish thighs, well, it ain't the worst thing to lay your eyes on, is it? Enemies consists of different varieties of cultists. They're not wearing robes and armed with shotguns or Tommy guns, but they can throw spikes or shoot fireballs, and some are even armed with a defensive shield. Other enemies include various kinds of demons, the most annoying being these 3-headed dogs that returned from the first episode. And look, as far as dog type enemies go, these have to be some of the most annoying ones I've ever come up against. I generally don't like having to shoot dogs in video games, even back to playing Wolfenstein 3D as a kid. But for these things, I'd happily kick them into a goddamn bottomless pit without a second thought. They suck. I'm not fond of those exploding enemies either. They're kind of similar to the sentry drones from Duke Nukem 3D. Hovering around and then trying to fly into the player to detonate. It's just annoying. Now, I doubt they get good internet speeds in the world of Hedon, more so because most people seem to live underground, but even then, it'd probably be worth Zan and the Iron Division looking at setting up a VPN. Yeah, that's right, it's that part of the video where I have to thank my sponsor, ExpressVPN. What's a VPN? Well, I'm so glad you asked. VPN is short for a virtual private network, and without using one of these, you're putting all of your personal information at risk there. Your emails, your passwords, and your internet search history. Yeah, all that Hedon R34 that you've been looking at, it all goes on there. Using a VPN though, all of your network data gets rerouted through a secure encrypted server, which means other people can't get access to it. ExpressVPN routes this information through over 3,000 servers, with you also being able to choose from servers in over 94 countries, and you get good speeds across the board too. The best thing to use this for without a doubt I think is streaming sites like Netflix. Changing my location to another country though, like the UK for instance, I could then watch a whole heap of different TV shows and movies that would probably never see the light of day in Australia. Like how I'm pretty much barely seeing the light of day either while this whole stupid lockdown goes on. I'd never promote something I don't use myself, but even then, if you don't want to take my word for it, you don't have to look all that far to see people saying good things about it. It's got great reviews on tech sites, but more importantly, it's got great user reviews. I've been using ExpressVPN for well over a year now without any issues. All you gotta do is click that connect button and that's pretty much all there is to it. And on the off chance that something goes wrong, which it won't, they also offer 24/7 customer support. So to find out how you can get 3 months for free, head on over to expressvpn.com/gman and get started. Right, so it has been a couple of years since I finished that first episode, and coming into this thing now, it's pretty hard to pick up all of the pieces, short of actually playing through the entire first episode again for a recap. As far as I can tell, this all takes place after Zan's been spat out of a wormhole deep underground after the climax in that first episode. She's in pursuit of the warlock Nithriel, who's responsible for the downfall of the Iron Division, and during all of this, Zan ends up actually meeting the leader for this demon faction she's been fighting, which is a Lovecraftian entity known only as the Baron. Along with reuniting with the Iron Division, who are regrouping for a final assault on the cult. Hey, that rhymes. Assault on the cult. Anyway, it is all the kind of stuff that gives people who are into lore a bit of a wet dream, and taking the time to read notes scattered around is going to give you even more insight into what's been going on. It's definitely one of the more detailed game worlds I've explored in recent memory, and considering it's mostly been worked on by a single person, it's even crazier considering just how much stuff has been crammed into it. And that kind of carries across to the gameplay side of things too. You see, Bloodrite is the perfect example of what happens when someone is able to make the exact game they want to from start to finish, with no one telling them what to add in or what to remove. I mean, it's a singular vision straight from the head of the creator. This is one seriously hardcore experience, and I mean that in a good way, but it really does not mess around when it comes to the puzzles and the combat. And honestly, playing through Hedon 2 has been one of the most mentally exhausting experiences I think I've had in a video game in recent memory. I played it for about 4 or 5 hours one day, just on and off with breaks in between, and by the end of the day, still not even being close to beating it, I honestly felt like I just finished a shift at work or something. You know when you have a rough day at work and you just want to go home, take your shoes off and watch something on the TV? Well, that's how I felt. It also reminded me a lot of playing through the Ancient Gods Part 1 DLC for Doom Eternal. Like, it just requires constant attention from the player. And let me tell you, the few moments of downtime you get are a welcome respite. And I think the reason for that is that Bloodrite just never really stops, and if you're not getting into combat with this roster of really tough enemies, you're running back and forth across multiple areas, picking up items, reading notes, and trying to figure out where or what you're supposed to be doing next. I mean, it makes Hexen 2 look like snakes and ladders in comparison. I define the combat in this thing as lateral, and by that I mean that enemies can attack from any angle at any time, and there's just so few moments in this when you can stop and catch your breath. Hedon has multiple difficulties, with hedonistic being the ideal way to play the game, according to the dev anyway. And I'd say that the combat on this setting is forgiving enough that you can get away with the odd screw up, but messing around too much with the AI is going to have them kick your shit in pretty damn quickly. The items in your inventory can actually turn the tide of a fight massively in your favor. There's potions that can decrease the damage you take, there's a shard that can stop time, or an S&M style choker that gives health back to Zam whenever you damage an enemy. And they aren't just really put in there as an option in case you get bored, like you're gonna need to use these things to get by sometimes. To understand the combat loop, I think obviously you're going to want to have played and finished that first episode before messing around, but even then, this second episode can be a really crushing experience. But I think a testament to how good the whole thing is was that I just didn't want to stop playing. Right off the bat, again, Bloodrite just oozes with atmosphere. One of the things the first episode did immensely well was its sound design, and you don't have to play that much of the second episode to see it here either. As you explore this opening environment, you've got the sound of howling wind, there's birds in the trees, and these other ethereal noises. It's so effortless, not to mention seamless, with different audio cues kind of distinguishing these different areas as you move through them. One of the other things I can also appreciate is that this second episode does seem to try to ease the player back into things. Bloodrite is again broken down into levels, but calling them levels is doing this thing a bit of a disservice. They're more kind of like singular locations with different biomes, along with different flora and enemy types to encounter along the way. This will also get more varied the further you get into the episode as well. And near the end, there's the kind of environments that made me think I'd crossed over into American McGee's Alice. When it comes to the puzzles, these starting areas are also pretty simple. It includes something like finding a book to decipher all these scattered notes, or picking up a shovel so you can use it to dig up a buried key. The locations of items at this point also fits within the kind of things you'd expect, so you'd find like a hidden passage behind a bookshelf for instance. Throughout these early areas, you also get assistance from an Iron Division Lancer, who's like a friendly character returning from the first episode who helps you out and attacks enemies. So it's really a pretty subtle way of the game trying to warm you up. It's like stretching your hamstrings before running a half marathon. The second level, it starts to kick things up a notch. This whole sequence is set around a big mansion where there's some brothers who are involved in the cult that have gotten up to no good and started causing trouble in the neighborhood. And this whole bit kind of reminded me a bit of Thief Gold. It's all very similar to that early mission in the Thieves Guild, even down to there being a room in the mansion that's got a few poker tables and some gambling chips. But then it's also reminiscent of something like Resident Evil, with all these areas of the mansion being locked off and hidden behind different doors requiring different keys. The exit to this area is hidden behind a door protected by these unholy seals, and there's all these books scattered throughout the area, which look a hell of a lot like the Necronomicon from Evil Dead, that need to be found and then shut so the pathway to the exit can be cleared. One of these books is even hidden inside an underground vault that you're going to need to break into, so yeah, see what I mean, how the whole thing reminds me of Thief? There's gates which can be lowered, creating shortcuts around the mansion grounds, and the whole thing's just full of hidden passages and secrets, which all seem to flow together really well as you find all of these components and craft whatever you need to get the hell out of there. You'll also start to really appreciate how every quest item has a sparkle around it, making them easier to spot amongst all these other props. From the third level though is when it starts to expand even more. Now at this point it's even less linear, and it really turns into a bit of a semi-open world game. Now you've met back up with the Iron Division and you've shacked up at their base of operations. There's briefing scenes before each mission where all of these side characters stand around and discuss their next move, which always just involves them giving Zan something else to do. There's half-dressed elves, orcs, and muscly minotaurs all standing around. And look, I've been on the internet long enough now to know that putting those three races together in one room's gonna send bodily fluids flying in all directions. At least I hope so. The whole area is pretty detailed too. There's a blacksmith who trades resources for spare ammo, there's a potion maker who's got a bunch of free potions sitting around, and then all these other NPCs you can talk to, who give pretty subtle hints on how you might be able to solve your current objective. And that's pretty helpful because there is bugger all hand-holding in this thing. You've got a giant forest to explore, there's pathways that branch off in different directions, there's an abandoned mine, there's an underground cave full of lava that also hides the entrance into a forgotten Minotaur village. The missions become a whole lot more varied too, like breaking out a bunch of captives from a cultist fortress, an area which also happens to contain the best Easter egg in the entire game. I think one of the highlights is this dwarven city where you've got to craft a diving suit so you can head underwater to explore all these sunken passageways. Eventually having to fight a few Lovecraftian priests who are literally a combination of the disciples from Heretic and the Archfiles from Doom 2. Yeah, these assholes float around like the disciples do, and then fire off a powerful line of sight blast exactly like the Archfiles. Keeping the whole thing very Lovecraftian too, these guys are killing you by making you go insane. Insane in the membrane. Insane in the brain. For its sheer size too, I think all of this stuff flows pretty well. I think there's the odd moment where you're not sure where to go next, but I found that all of these areas seem to be constructed really well. If you're playing on hedonistic, all of the important elements of the notes you read are highlighted in gold font, so if you're reading everything you come across, it should be pretty easy to figure out what the game wants you to do. I kinda like the fact too how you're always rewarded for your curiosity, whether it be spare ammo or just some kind of important item. In fact, a lot of the time I thought I was on my way to a secret area, but it ended up being the way I was supposed to be going. A lot of the music throughout all of these first few levels is also really good stuff. Like the first episode, Hedon uses a lot of unused tracks composed by Alexander Brandon and Michiel van den Bos, the guys who worked on Deus Ex and the Unreal series. And it captures that perfect mix of being industrial and grungy combined with the more fantasy and surreal element to Hedon's underlying story. Where it really starts to drag though is what comes after this for the second act. Yeah, and you can actually thank me for the episode being broken down into 2 acts. It was part of the feedback I gave to Zan after beating this thing. The reason I say that is because this second act has some of the most complex puzzles and environments I've experienced in recent memory. And I think a big part of the problem there is that it all comes after a really huge climactic sequence of levels that you play back to back. The conclusion, or the finale I guess, for the first act involves all of your allies from the Iron Division camp executing this massive offensive on the cultist base. You're moving through the streets of this town as you try to cut a path through it to find the Baron. By this point, you've been playing the game now for probably about 5 or 6 hours, and all of the characters in the game refer to what's coming as the final battle, so it has a real sense of conclusiveness. You've saved all your allies, you've done all the legwork, and you can now stage this climactic fight against the cult. There's a sequence inside this giant opened up area where you fight dozens of enemies at once, followed by a boss fight against a giant hellhound. After that, you carve your way through enemy forces on a bridge to finally meet up with the Baron, and you'd think that that might be it, but no. Next up, you're in the middle of the ocean, platforming from boat to boat to reach the Baron's flagship, one of which has demons in a cage who are dancing like they're the strippers from Duke Nukem 3D for some reason.
Shake it, baby.
After this, you then wash up on the shores of hell, literally, for the second and final act of the game, which honestly goes longer than everything else before it combined. It'd be like, imagine if when they made Empire Strikes Back, right? Luke gets in that fight with Vader, has his hand chopped off, sorry, spoilers. And then instead of ending it there, they added in the whole act from Return of the Jedi where they go and free Han from Jabba the Hutt. That's kind of what it feels like at this point. For this final area, you've now got to earn the taints of these demonic Primarchs to get access to where the Baron's hiding. And this map is considerably larger than anything you've explored that far. Now you've got underground crypts, graveyards, forests surrounded by poisonous mushrooms, more underground mines, an ethereal garden and a cursed cathedral. And of course areas surrounded by liquid hot magma. For pretty much every single one of these Primarchs, the simple act of winning them over has about half a dozen things you need to do before it, for each one of them. One of these Primarchs is like the demon of seduction or sex or whatever, and to get this one's approval, you've got to befoul yourself by sleeping with a creature that's got demon blood. And hey, look, Zan's a pretty good looking chick, she should be able to pull a root pretty easily. There's even a willing succubus who happens to be nearby, only this bitch has got about half a dozen requirements before she's willing to hand over the goods. You have to win her approval and admiration before she'll even sleep with you. I mean, what is this, real life or something? For starters, you've got to survive a few combat sequences where she spawns in a bunch of enemies, and these are at least simple enough. Then after a bunch of those, you're inside her quarters, and you would assume that's all you need to do. But then after that, she goes a bit vague and ambiguous, and then sends you off on a bit of a treasure hunt. Reading scattered notes around the area, you realise she told her gardener a lot of secrets, only this guy's now dead. Yeah, so to find out what he knew, you need to somehow find his remains and scan the remnants of his mind. I'm not even kidding. And then getting a hold of this thing requires a bunch of different items, along with just finding out where his mind is actually being kept. Then after you've found all of that stuff, she's still got more requirements. First off, there's another fight inside a cathedral, leaving the place covered in blood, body parts and debris, kinda like your mum's bedroom is the morning after I'm done with her. Followed by 3 platforming sections through areas I can only describe as an LSD nightmare. Ending with another combat sequence on a giant bouncing bed, which is one of the worst things ever made by another human being. Finally, once you've jumped through so many hoops that the sex doesn't even seem worth it, all you get for your hard work is a brief glimpse of her boobs as she pulls her top off, then it all cuts to black. Yeah, the old classic fade out during a sex scene gimmick. Love it.
Are you shitting me?
Now, remember, that's only one of the 5 Primarchs taken care of. There's still 4 more to go after that. I came up with a bit of an analogy of how the puzzles feel at this point. It'd be like, imagine someone asking you to wash their car, right? Only they don't have a sponge or any soap. So you go to the supermarket to buy them, only to find that the supermarket doesn't sell sponges or soap anymore. Now you realize you're not in a supermarket, but you're in a hardware store. And the guy at the register doesn't speak English. Also, your hands are on fire, your legs are made of toast, and your friend's turned into a wombat. I do think the length of this final act is a bit of a blessing and a curse. I mean, if you're like me, you really want to finish this in a couple of sittings, but that's just really not an option. But I feel like once you stop playing, everything then gets out of your short-term memory, which means you kind of forget what you're doing pretty quickly. There's always like half a dozen things you're supposed to be doing at once here, and ending a session when you're halfway through some of these, like taking a break and coming back the next day, is kind of like closing a book that doesn't have page numbers without putting a bookmark in. Speaking of books, the one saving grace here is Zan's journal, which thankfully does keep you updated on everything you're currently working on. Does it make the whole thing bad? Well, look, no, it doesn't. In fact, I actually appreciate and admire how much effort and time must have gone into this stuff. Not just implementing it, but also making sure the whole thing works cohesively. But man, this second act is fucking confusing. I've always thought that Hexen 2 is the toughest first-person shooter I've ever played when it comes to the puzzle side of things. Definitely way harder than Hexen 1 was, and the only people who'd say otherwise are people who never finished Hexen 2. Hexen is definitely an influence on Hedon, and come this final chapter, you're gonna see exactly why that is. I mean, I'm actually kinda glad when you get a bit of combat. Like, it's like a breath of fresh air in between your brain hemorrhaging trying to figure out what you're supposed to be doing next. The only main element to Bloodrite's combat that I really have issue with is just some of the combat sequences. I really think that Hedon's combat isn't very good in tight, confined spaces, and the problem with Bloodrite's combat is that it often takes place in tight, confined spaces. There's so many little props like furniture, vases, sacks of shit, and all this kind of stuff, which does a great job at making the world look more detailed, but it kind of plays havoc during combat when you're trying to avoid enemy attacks. Enemies hit pretty damn hard in this game, and not being able to actively avoid them because you're in a room the size of a matchbox ain't helping. That area inside that old Minotaur village, it kind of feels like you're fighting in a goddamn broom closet. Or the enemies are hiding inside these little houses, or they're on the top of roofs somewhere and shooting at you through windows, blending in with all the nearby buildings because of the color palette. Like, it's just an outright handicap. Overall though, when it all came to an end, 12 or so hours later, finally finishing Bloodrite felt pretty well earned. And I can see myself sitting down on a tree stump someday with a pipe in my hand, a small group of children nearby, regaling my story back to them at that time that I finally finished Hedon 2. Despite the minor problems I think this thing has with pacing, it's kind of hard to deny that the sheer amount of content it has is just staggering. And in a sea of early access and proof of concept titles, a single episode which runs longer than most modern games, it's pretty hard to ignore, man. So look, if you already own this thing, then make sure you download the free update for Bloodrite and get back into killing cultists with an axe and an explosive crossbow. If you haven't bought it yet, well then shame on you, but there's still time to pick it up and experience just how good shooting things in the GZ Doom engine can possibly be when you're playing as a Thicc, busty orc goddess. And look, if that's a sales pitch that doesn't get you interested, well, then nothing will.